Who do you want to be today?
We have nothing to fear but fear itself.
Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a very bumpy night.
Yo, Adrian. You're gonna let me fight Apollo again, you know what I mean?
You dirty rat.
We shall never surrender.
Oh! Can we talk?
Frankly, Scarlett, I don't give a damn.
I get no respect.
Slip into the lives of some of the world's most fascinating people. Watch A&D's biography and escape the ordinary.
I could have been somebody, Charlie.
From A&D, this is Biography.
His mother said, John will either be a genius or amount to nothing at all. John Steinbeck was a genius who wrote about the rough edges of a 20th century America, still raw and naive and brutal to those who wanted a part of her. Steinbeck wrote like Edward Hopper painted, like Nighthawks, about familiar, edgy, lonely folks, like George Gershwin composed a rhapsody, sassy, swaggering, sweetly dissonant music. Not true art, cried many of their critics. Too common, said others, but right on the money as far as the public was concerned. Folks in his hometown condemned Steinbeck as a dishonest author who exposed their dirty little secrets. Steinbeck, though, considered his writing a mirror, accurate, and not always flattering.
I'm John Steinbeck. I was born on this coast. I've always thought of this place as a breeder of stories.
It sounds a little corny, but he absolutely just loved living life.
John Steinbeck listened to the land and wrote books about the people who belonged to it.
Go on, George. Tell about the rabbits and how I get to tend them.
He loved writing about prostitutes and how wonderful they could be.
Hemingway influenced the way people wrote more than John Steinbeck did. But what people write about, I think John was a much greater influence. The humanity and the caring about the underdog.
Wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there.
There were a lot of people around, not only in the Soviet Union, but in the United States, who had it in for John.
He was a dissident in his own time, whose voice resonated through America's soul.
Wonderfully shy, women adored him, great to travel with, most entertaining man you want to know. But that's not the man who sat writing the books, and I will never pretend to know that any better than you do.
I remember my childhood names for grasses and secret flowers. I remember where a toad may live and what time birds awaken in the summer, and what trees and seasons smelled like, how people looked and walked and smelled even. The memory of odors is very rich.
At the turn of the century, Salinas, California was a staid town of 2,500 and home to most of the area's agricultural landowners. There, John Steinbeck was born February 27, 1902, the only son among 3 sisters. The boy was mollycoddled by a strong-willed mother. Olive Hamilton was the blue-stocking daughter of a large Irish family who ran their own ranch further down the Long Valley outside King City. At 17, she had gone to work as a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse.
Olive was a harsh taskmaster, and she must have been to ride that mule down to Big Sur and teach those unruly ranch kids, and probably didn't treat my father any differently than she did any of her other students.
Olive met John Ernst Steinbeck at a church social. He was the son of German immigrants. He had a white-collar job and a stoic demeanor. Olive was the ambitious one. She willed the family onto the social register.
I always said she was a social climber, and one of the gals that I knew says, "Oh no, she's not a climber, she is society."
The Steinbecks were Victorian, right down to their house on a prominent corner in Salinas. Neighborhood children called it the Castle. It was in this house that John learned about gentility, storytelling, and books. John Sr. was a failed entrepreneur who had managed to get appointed Monterey County Treasurer. He had the sullen quality of a man unfulfilled.
Mr. Steinbeck used to bind books in the basement. So he must have loved books. I mean, to do that, you have to love the physical qualities of a book.
At school, young John was shy and socially awkward. His only close friend was his sister Mary.
It was a kind of Tom Sawyer upbringing, but he was very much Tom Sawyer and not Huck Finn. He was the boy who, had money and position in the neighborhood, and was expected to go on to law school or become a doctor.
At the age of 9, his Aunt Molly gave him a present that would forever change his life: Sir Thomas Malory's book of Arthurian legends. John and Mary turned the arroyos of the Salinas Valley into their own Camelot. During his freshman year in high school, John told his parents he wanted to be a writer. They thought he would outgrow it.
He'd see something that was of interest, he'd make a note of it. His dresser drawer was just full of little notes, little squares of paper. He'll happen to have a piece of paper that he could write on. He'd have a pencil with him all the time. He'd write it down and stuff it away in the drawer.
In 1919, Steinbeck enrolled at Stanford University, where he adopted a new, rakish persona for himself, living in a wood shack and distilling plum wine. To his mother's dismay, Steinbeck had little interest in graduating. For 6 years, he dropped in and out of school, studying only what he felt he needed to be a better writer.
He went to the dean of the med school and asked him if he could take a medical school course in cutting up cadavers. And the dean said, you're an English major. What in the world do you want to take that course for? And he said, I want to learn about human beings.
John regularly took semesters off to live and work in the fields, partly for money, but more to gather stories from the Latinos and roustabouts he met.
He found out they had wonderful stories, and he would really pay them money. He would pay them 50 cents, $1 for a story.
He called himself a shameless magpie, which is a lovely phrase. I mean, he was always listening, and he was the writer. He was the one who wrote it down. And anything's fair game for a writer.
In 1925, Steinbeck did what other great American writers had done before him. He moved to New York to be a reporter. But his first job was as a construction worker on Madison Square Garden. His uncle Joe Hamilton finally got him a job at the New York American. John was fired within a few months for getting too involved with the people he was writing about. Crestfallen and starving, Steinbeck returned to California in the summer of 1926. For the next 2 years, John worked as a caretaker in remote Lake Tahoe, spending the long winter months alone, writing his first novel, the forgettable Cup of Gold.
He would be there all winter and he could just write his heart out and he wouldn't be interrupted. And in fact, it was really good for him, except he ran out of paper and he had to start writing his stories in the margins of magazines and so on because he couldn't get to a store.
In the summer of 1928, John met a vacationing girl from a prominent San Jose family, Carol Henning. She was sharp-tongued, attractive, and very funny. The two immediately fell in love.
John had Carol typing his manuscript of Cup of Gold the first week they met, so she knew what she was in for.
At the end of the summer, John followed Carol to San Francisco, where he eked out a living and dieted on sardines, donuts, and coffee. For dates, he and Carol would take the streetcar to Ocean Beach, where they would drink wine and sleep on the sand. The following year, John and Carol eloped to Los Angeles, but didn't have enough money to stay. With the Depression on, they moved to the Steinbeck family's vacation cottage in Pacific Grove, just up the road from Monterey. They fell in with a thriving bohemian culture that included muckraking journalist Lincoln Steffens and mythologist Joseph Campbell.
Steinbeck had a wonderful circle of friends, and every night they would meet at a different house and talk. That was when he really got his education.
It was in Monterey that Steinbeck also met the most important man in his life, a marine biologist who operated a lab on the wharf. His name was Ed Ricketts.
John knew darn well that Dad could see things in the tide pools that other people couldn't. And Dad admired the way that John could listen to a person, understand a person, or eavesdrop on a person.
Years later, Steinbeck would cast his best friend as Doc Ricketts, the central character in his book, Cannery Row. When John finished his next book, he didn't have the money to send it to his agent. He did, however, have a new subject for his writing, the landscape of his youth.
He was enormously well-read, but when you read his writing, it doesn't seem influenced by another writer. He wrote in his own voice.
And the air was as golden gauze in the last of the sun. The land below them was plotted in squares of green orchard trees, and in squares of yellow grain, and in squares of violet earth. From the sturdy farmhouses set in their gardens, the smoke of the evening fires swept upward until the hill breeze swept it cleanly off. Cowbells were softly clashing in the valley. A dog barked so that far away the sound rose up to the travelers in sharp little whispers. "It's called Las Pasturas de Cielo," the driver said. "They raise good vegetables there, good berries and fruit earlier here than any place else. The name means pastures of heaven."
I said, when Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway and all those people were traveling in the 20s and 30s, why didn't you go? And he said, I didn't have the price of a ticket. And right now, I'm glad I didn't, because I stayed home and wrote about my own people, my own sea, my own land.
Pastures of Heaven failed to sell even 1,000 copies, but its vision of man and place made it a small masterpiece, setting the stage for a lifetime of books to follow. By the age of 30, John Steinbeck had found his voice as an author and his life as an artist. He and his wife Carol lived in comfortable poverty, struggling as they felt artists should, making do with good friends and with each other.
Their families were very Victorian, very respectable, and I think both John and Carol wanted to define themselves against that background, wanted to be something else. And so I think they met as sort of rebellious spirits, restless spirits, and found one another.
John's father gave the couple $50 a month, which Carol supplemented with odd jobs. John spent his days writing. Carol typed and edited his pages at night. In early 1933, Steinbeck's mother Olive suffered a massive stroke. John and Carol moved back to his family's Victorian home to care for her.
He did all the laundry and kept the house clean and everything. The sisters didn't seem to care whether they helped or not, the way I understand it.
In her later years, John's mother had become one of his greatest supporters. During her illness, he spent his days at a small desk outside her room writing a children's story, The Red Pony. Olive Steinbeck died in February 1934. John's father grew listless, and his health also began to decline. John's response was to write his most comic novel and his first popular success, Tortilla Flat.
This is the story of Danny and of Danny's friends and of Danny's house. It is the story of how these three became one thing. So that in Tortilla Flat, if you speak of Danny's house, you do not mean a structure of wood flaked with old whitewash, overgrown with an ancient untrimmed rose of Castile. No, when you speak of Danny's house, you are understood to mean a unit of which the parts are men, from which came sweetness and joy, philanthropy, and in the end, a mystic sorrow.
The book was Steinbeck's first attempt to retell the Arthurian legends that had captivated him in childhood, this time with a group of wine-drinking paisanos in the Monterey Hills.
You know, he grew up with Mexicans. As an adolescent, he drove with them in their cars and drank beer with them. And they were just people, you know. Race wasn't an issue, but class was.
As John's father grew increasingly sick, he told his son that he had never done anything he had wanted to do. John Sr. had always encouraged his son's ambitions as a writer. He would not get to see them fulfilled. 5 days before the book was published, John Ernst Steinbeck died. Tortilla Flat was a bestseller and pushed Steinbeck into the limelight. John would have none of it. He and Carol built a small home in the Santa Cruz Mountains. To dissuade visitors, they named it Arroyo del Ajo, or Garlic Gulch.
He was recognized on the streets of San Francisco after a picture of him appeared in the Chronicle. And he was so nauseated, he threw up.
But he was shy. Yeah, he was very shy. That's why I think his handwriting was so small. You see this massive bulk and this sea captain is like writing little tiny, it looks like a bunch of M's in some of the best literature ever written in America, and you can't make heads or tail of it.
Failure had always been manageable, and poverty calming. But John was unable to deal with success. His main solace was his friendship with marine biologist Ed Ricketts. They would spend late nights in Ed's lab drinking wine and thinking deep thoughts. Ricketts believed that mankind must be examined scientifically, as a species, not moralistically as individuals.
I think it's one of the influences Rickett had on Steinbeck was getting him to see beyond the Petri dish, that the Petri dish was the whole planet in a sense, and what was micro was macro. And I think Steinbeck was very much micro-macro. In that sense, what was true on his tiniest scale was true on his largest scale.
At the height of the Depression, biological issues such as the survival of man were very real, as people searched for food, for land, and for a future. While Ricketts inspired Steinbeck's philosophy, Carroll inspired his politics.
Carroll had awakened in him a social conscience. Once it was awakened, it was a slumbering giant. And this man had a conscience with a big C.
Salinas, California, 1936.
By the mid-30s, violent cotton and lettuce strikes had erupted around Salinas. The entire country seemed to be going through convulsions. Steinbeck responded with a brilliant and stark examination in dubious battle. His next book was inspired by his days working the fields. It was a simple story of two Bindlestiffs, Lenny and George, looking for a home. It was immediately adapted into a hit Broadway play and later into a powerful movie of Mice and Men.